Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Enrico Castillo, and I'm very excited to welcome our speaker for today's Grand Rounds. Dr. Katerina Fotopoulou was born and educated in Greece before moving to the UK to study psychoanalysis, cognitive neuropsychology, and neuroscience at University College London and the University of Durham. She's now a professor in psychodynamic neuroscience, a chartered psychologist, and the director of the Center for Equality Research in Brain Sciences at University College London. Her lab focuses on topics and disorders that lie at the interface between physical and mental health, funded initially by a starting investigator grant and more recently by a consolidator grant from the European Research Council. Dr. Fotopoulou has been the recipient of many awards for her research and teaching and is currently the president-elect of the European Society for Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, and the outgoing president of the psychology section of the British Science Foundation. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone, feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can do that anytime during the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end during the Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Fotopoulou.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've heard a lot here in the UK about your institute. So even though I can't see you and I can't be there in this modern, increasingly virtual world of ours, I am delighted to be here and sharing this talk and hopefully a discussion with you all. Thank you also to the so far excellent organizing. Everything seems to run like a clock, so I don't want to ruin that. I will start right ahead with sharing my screen if I can. Doesn't seem to be the beginning for some reason, but it does seem to be the right file, which is encouraging. Right, and I trust you all can see that, or otherwise somebody will shout at me. And let me just move some of the faces so I can actually see where I'm going. So I'm going to be talking about equality research in brain sciences. I'm going to try to cover a little bit the local and the global level. And I'm really going to talk about what we've been trying to do in what we call the Center for Equality Research in Brain Sciences at UCL that I currently direct. But first, a note on me. So why on earth would I be so interested in equality and in equity? It's not what I do all of the time. It's not what pays the rent in the past 20 years. What pays the rent is research at the interface between physical and mental health, the psychological aspects of stroke or dementia, the neurological aspects of pain and functional disorders. This is my sort of expertise. But I do always have the tendency to marry approaches, perspectives, and people that don't tend to want to go together. And I do want to always mitigate conflict as a person. And I think that comes from where I come from, which is a small, funny place at the bottom of the Mediterranean, literally between Europe and Asia. So my mother and her side come actually from Turkey. They are Greeks of the older Greek villages and cities of an area called Cappadocia, deep into Turkey, that some generations ago moved to Istanbul, the city that is literally divided between Europe and Asia. But she came to Greece and met my dad, who comes from a village not too far from Delphi, the important ancient Greek temple of Apollo with its very famous oracle. So these two parents moved into Athens and have tried to live together. And it was an absolute disaster, even though if you hear from afar, I'm Greek, that says very, very little. Actually, my parents saw themselves as coming from very different cultures, very different ethnic groups, very different ethnicities, cultures, language. The amount of language misunderstanding in my household was something else. And I guess as a child, I've learned to find that very difficult and to sometimes want to bridge that gap because I was Greek and I was based in the capital of Greece. But for them, they came from different Greeces, different backgrounds, and maybe they had the reasons to hold some of this tension. So after this long introduction, I think I find myself in academia and in science motivated deeply by these difficult tensions between where we come from and where we're going. And a note on language, I will use words throughout this presentation that have been the target of equality and equity work. So, for example, the term BAME in English, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic staff, is a very commonly used word when we target action, but actually it ignores vast differences between the groups. Sex is not gender identity, but in the UK, it's sex, the word sex, the term sex, that is the protected characteristic under law. So we target some of this action because of that. And more generally, I recognize that not everyone agrees with the use of certain terms in this area. And translation, particularly today to a US context, is not straightforward, and we shouldn't assume so. And I do recognize that language is important. The symbolic level of our existence matters. However, to paraphrase one of my favorite poets, I prefer the absurdity of trying to communicate with others imperfectly than the absurdity of not trying at all. And a note of conflict of interest, the last note, I promise. I do not stand to benefit in any financial or in-kind way from this presentation, but I am the director of this new nonprofit UCL Center, and it will, in some of my slides and content, feel like I'm trying to sell its academic and its societal value to you as a model of equity. And this is my goal, but I hope you will see that it is a goal that I truly believe in its value. And really what I'm going to try to sell, and I'm going to do that in 3 parts, is the following. I'm going to say that this is an important model for how we go forwards that actually goes beyond equity action itself, which is necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. One model that promotes research on equality, of course, that is this main purpose. But actually, it tries to do that by conceptualizing, governing, supporting, promoting such research, not just doing the research, to the mainstream of all mind and brain sciences and allied health-related fields. And I'm going to argue that really we need all these 3 things, action, research, and the embeddedness of research in the mainstream of what we do and the mainstream of our institutions if we are ever going to meet the challenge we have. And I'm going to ground it a little bit, UCL, University College London, where I work. So UCL is a relatively old institution. It was founded in 1826. Some people think it was founded by Jeremy Bentham. It wasn't, but it was inspired by his ideas. He's the sort of classic utilitarianism scholar of the time, where he says that we should judge people by their traits, we should judge by their actions, and particularly he thinks that the best actions are the actions that provide, famously, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, you might argue with a lot of the naive assumptions of classic hedonistic approaches like he did, but you can't argue with the fact that for his time, he was really a proponent in human rights, in animal rights. He fought for the decriminalization of homosexuality, and he was very keen on education for all religions, something that was not the case in the UK at the time, and genders. And so UCL accordingly becomes the first university in England to welcome students from any religion that was unheard of at King's and Cambridge and Oxford, or social background. And it's also the first in England to welcome women to university education. And it hasn't done badly. UCL is consistently, whatever value these metrics have, but in them, it's consistently rated as among the first 10 or 20 universities in the world in the past decades. And we are particularly proud of our neuroscience achievements in research. We frequently call UCL Europe's neuroscience powerhouse. It is first in Europe in neuroscience and behavior and psychologist, and apparently second in the world. It produces most highly cited biomedical and health sciences papers than any other institution in Europe. And it's the best in the UK for psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. Again, different metrics, UCL doing very well in all of them. Let me introduce you to one of our staff, Dr. Lazana Harris. He's a professor of social neuroscience. His research explores the brain and physiological correlates of prejudice, dehumanization, and decision-making. And when he was hired at UCL 6 years ago, he was our only Black professor in psychology. And let me introduce you to Natalie Mercant, Associate Professor of Mental Health in Older Adults. Her research explores the lifestyle and mental health factors that increase risk or resilience to neurodegeneration, cognitive impairment, and dementia. When she was hired at UCL 5 years ago, she noted that there were no peers that looked like her in her psychiatry department. Across UCL, as monitored in 2021 and 22, Black academic staff represented 1.4% of all academic staff. And that is way below, as you can see here at the bottom, UK census, which is 4% for Black staff and 18% including other ethnic minorities. And it gets interesting once we move up the hierarchy. Female academics are underrepresented at senior levels, particularly if you look intersectionally at how many Black, Asian, and ethnic minority women are at some of our top grades, for example, grade 10. That's only 4% compared with 8% equivalent males, 30% white males, and 57% white males. Sorry, the previous one was females. So you see a huge difference as we go. It doesn't matter. You know, this is the point where you say to your students, or you're correcting anything you read, and you say, who cares? What does it matter? Well, first, there's an obvious moral argument. It's the right thing to do, diversity. Values of fairness, inclusion, collaborations, diversity, equal opportunity. These are central to our modern democratic moralities. But it's not only just the right thing to do. It also turns out to be the best thing to do in science, as probably most of you will have read or heard. There's quite a lot of evidence across different fields, including business administration, showing that diverse teams are more productive, are more innovative, they think in more creative ways and look at different topics and different solutions, and are also of greater impact, not only because of what they do, but because of how many people listen to them, than homogeneous groups. And there's an obvious health benefit that perhaps here in this center and institute you know all too well. It is the best thing to do in medicine. So diverse groups are better equipped to address the well-documented health disparities and inequalities that we have created. And also, diverse groups study a bigger part of the pie. They're interested in topics that homogeneous groups are not interested, and that drives the research agenda. So are we failing the vision of UCL? Well, UCL prides itself on being London's global university, as our marketeers say. But its senior staff are not even representative of the UK population. Now, that is not necessarily a UCL exclusive problem. We all recognize common accessibility, diversity, and leaky pipeline problems across the sector. And we know that these have wider political, societal, and economic causes. Yet UCL also, as I've been trying to say, prides itself for being a catalyst for change and an impactful UK institution with global reach. So we have work to do. And UCL has indeed, in fairness, doing a lot of work, increasingly in the past 5 years, and even more so in the last couple of years. And our faculty, the Faculty of Brain Sciences, stands out for some of our equality work. And the challenge we set ourselves is how to increase EDI in what is otherwise, as I said, Europe's neuroscience powerhouse, a really very strong, impactful, full of talent and impact and power set of researchers. How do you do that? Well, you go at it at all levels would be how I would summarize this. And you start, not necessarily start, but you definitely need to involve the top. So we were lucky to have the support of the faculty leadership. We set 5-year strategic and government plans with 6 pillars, lots of clarity and engagement given to staff. The leadership of the faculty built a leadership of EDI specific that had at least 20 people leading diversity, inclusion, or equality teams and committees. They based that in some rather sophisticated, unheard of analysis before that. And most importantly, it was data-driven. And it was based on a framework we call the Athena Swan model, including an action plan to regularly track our progress. Now, you might all have heard about this and being very banal, but I'm going to assume that you don't know a lot about the Athena Swan framework. So what is the Athena Swan framework? It's a charter. It's an agreement made and represented by advanced HE that universities will buy in, and they will share this framework, which is kind of an assessment framework that asked sort of universities to produce self-narrative reports and metrics and data about how well they're doing, particularly around gender equality. This was established in 2005. Initially, some universities bought in, and then it became a cross-sector badge of honor to be approved by Athena Swan Charter, which really, really helped. And they were able to do guidelines and some common action, and they were quite strict. And they initially target gender equality in STEM, but by now, today, 2024, the Charter has really broadened out to address not just gender inequality, but all inequality, particularly areas of intersection. And so what I mean by all inequality is there is a race charter that's run by the same people, but also looking at all genders and looking at other protected characteristics and looking at their intersection. And so not just focused on women. And if you're interested even more, just to say that it has gone international. So some other countries like Ireland and Australia and the US under sea change, that you probably know more about it than me, and Canada have seen if they can import some of this framework for equity action in academia. And how does it really work? What do I think is the quintessential thing? And I worked with Athena Swan myself for 5 years. I think it's data-driven. That's the most important thing about it. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. So you don't just start with an idea that there is a problem. You need to gather evidence to identify the particular level and nature of the problem. Then you design with your people a change based on action. And so you generate an action plan. That's where our faculty got the idea of having an action plan too. And then you use data again to document any impact and to analyze it, to interpret it, to be reflective and critical about it. Now, I'm not giving you a lot of details. It might all be a bit Greek to you. Here's an example. So what we did, for example, at the faculty level is we appointed a faculty gender equity lead. Now, in each department, we had already appointed EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, departmental directors. We want them to have power, and they led their EDI committee, which is what these departments wanted to do in a bottom-up way. But at the top-down level, we said the faculty needs to coordinate this. Otherwise, there might be silent areas that things are not working or different power dynamics. So we let the bottom up and we combined with in gender equity here, but also in religion, disability, race, etc. equity. Then we developed a faculty-wide guideline and model about how best to commission your Athena Swan, your self-assessment committee, the committee that was going to run these efforts for equity. And we helped them with it. We gave them something we call the Delphi model. And why do we call it the Delphi? Because it's meant to be strategic, data-based, action-oriented. These are all the Athena Swan stuff, but also hierarchical and predictive. And that is our stuff. And it really comes out of Delphi, where, if you remember, is close to where my father comes from. Delphi is the famous sanctuary in Greece, and it's famous in ancient Greece for its oracle, who, if you wanted to say to have war between two states, you went to the oracle and it told you what they thought the outcome of the war would be. So it is all about foresight. So we felt that the important aspect of leadership is to help our people and our committees, not to overburden them, but to help them spread the burden and have this burden officially recognized as part of workload and rewarded. And so it was our job to do these structures while the people did the work. So we thought hard about how to run it, how to govern it, how to lead it. And we felt that a best model at the time was to divide their action in these 3 levels. So traditionally, Athena Swan in most departments is done down here by a so-called action group with the operational level. But that exhausts the people doing it because they're both leaders, decision makers, and the ones having to run things. And that happens a lot in universities. So we said, no, you need to have different people that do the leadership. Of course, there's some commonality between these levels. Different people that do the decision making and different people that do the operation. And that's exactly what we did. And then we allowed our division to implement their model with quite a lot of diversity in the way they wanted. And they were successful. Within 3-4 years, we had 5 silver awards. That is as close to perfection as most departments get in this charter, and 1 bronze Athena award for our smaller departments. Indeed, as our amazing Vice Dean has been saying, over the last years, we have seen marked improvements in key metrics that signify progress. And that came down to working as much as we can together. Of course, there's a lot of problems with Athena Swan framework, and I am about to tell you some of them. And also the point I want to make that while I'm presenting this as a very good story, and it is a very good story, it's unfortunately what we've learned through it is that it's not sufficient. It's nowhere near sufficient, even though we have so many more women and much bigger diversity and representation now than we have even 2 years ago. And now we have awards and we have ways of getting people in to UCL specifically with equity actions. It's still nowhere near enough. So what could be missing? Well, typically, even through this careful planning, EDI work is perceived as a separate, value-added administrative rather than core institutional activity like education, research, or public engagement. Staff that undertake it are frequently the ones most needing equity support for recognition of work activities rather than taking up an extra administrative or leadership role. And in science fields, such work itself actually may require additional training, new knowledge and skills, typically from the humanities or social scientist or managerial, business, administrative kind of skills. Because, you're trained in, I don't know, fMRI analysis, or you're training in psychiatric interviews. You're not necessarily training how to run and do and instill change in a systemic, institutionalized way. And trying to sample the opinion or perspectives of minorities is frequently done with things like focused groups or qualitative methods that is not necessarily part and parcel of some fields under neuroscience and psychology and psychiatry. And there's more to it. So not all equity connections are made equal. So this is a very nice paper that maps the distribution, the connections of health equity research and practice across one university. So with a network analysis, but what they really did is a snowball survey, it's called, where you interview or you give a survey to a member of staff, and then you say, who else do you recommend we need to ask? And who else do you think is good in research on equity or in administration on equity? Who else do you know and who else do you value, etc., etc. And so it snowballs. And that allows them to map the network of these researchers and equity activists within the same university. And there's a lot of things to look at in this paper, but the interesting finding is that social peer recognition, in other terms, the amount of times you were recommended, was most likely for the people that were involved in equity research, not just other equity roles. So in a way, if you're doing equity practice, you don't get as much recognized as if you're doing equity research as well as other things. What else is missing? Well, as you all know, there's increasing recognition of the persistent socioeconomic, health, education, science, and technological access and representation inequalities. AI is in the news all the time, for example, for reproducing or even making worse some historical marginalization of certain communities, reproducing stereotypes, stereotypical images, going to the other extreme, etc., etc. And we all learned the consequences, and I know there's been some work in your institute of unequal responses to COVID-19 and some of the perils of lack of diversity. It's harder to get to people, harder to convince them about what is needed or about the communications of risks when you don't represent them already and when they haven't learned to trust your scientific models. And so what is the map for dealing with these increasingly recognized challenges? Well, I'm sure you know, but the same applies in the UK. EDI, or some people call it DEI, is a key strategic priority in most science, industry, policy, academic, educational, healthcare institutions, including our funders, right? I think you will struggle to find any major institution in our midst that doesn't have an EDI committee, an EDI policy, an EDI event. But is all this action measured by anybody? Does anybody see what drives it? Are the various interactive factors really modeled in any way? Are any of the new methods we have in science applied? Are methods combined? Most importantly, things happen in a system. Is the systemic aspects of the problem accounted for by anybody, or is people studying their little thing in one corner? The mapping doesn't seem to be driven by research. It seems to be driven by ideology, perhaps morality, events, seminar, opinion, guidelines, even the media. What else is missing? What about UCL? Where, as I said, UCL has a strong commitment in recognizing and targeting these structural inequalities. And it's also Europe's research powerhouse in neuroscience and psychology. And EDI is a key strategic priority for UCL. And so UCL Neuroscience, not only as a leadership, culture, and administrative target, but perhaps the solution to the problem would be that we leverage our research excellence and power towards equality research, specifically in brain and mind sciences, studying mechanisms and effects. That's something we're going to return back to that specificity. So it hasn't happened at that historical point that I'm covering. It's happening now, but the idea is that UCL neuroscience and related mind fields could shape the mapping. We shouldn't let the mapping just to opinion. And this is really why we started the center, to try to address what is missing at an institutional level and to bring governance to research and research to governance, which I'm trying to argue why it's necessary. Because it can drive and target EDI action by research excellence, and it can drive research excellence and its impact by institutionalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. It can create diverse research role models and leaders, not just of research, but research inequality. I hope that's clear. And it can allow us to transfer skills from brain and mind sciences to equality research, pioneering novel mixed methods and approaches. It can target the health risks that are higher, as we know, in minority groups currently, but are also underrepresented among researchers. And it can target the phenomena that are currently understudied due to researcher, but also due to funder, policymaker, and public bias. And there are many examples of that. Just because you have an intention or because you have a policy, it doesn't mean that you can translate it to action in a way that it's truly equitable. That is something that requires positioning, reflection, research, and much more. And we felt the time is ripe. Clearly, you all know that there's a big transformation happening in the field. There's a field within brain and mind sciences. There's a sort of recognition of the issue now, and lots of efforts and lots of writing, lots of opinion papers, lots of perspectives. And indeed, as soon as we launched the center, Nature covered us and our opinion and passion straight ahead. But by that token, if we have all the public will and the scientific will, and we have the research, shouldn't that be enough? You would have thought, surely. And it turns out, and this is a very interesting, relatively recent finding with a very ambiguous title, which I think says a story about what happened during peer review, that found the following. The three experiments, men were found to evaluate the research that showed gender bias in academia less favorably than women. And of concern, this gender difference was especially prominent among the STEM faculty. This finding, say the authors, is problematic because broadening the participation of underrepresented people in STEM, including women, necessarily requires a widespread willingness, particularly by those in the majority, to acknowledge that bias exists before transformation is possible. Again, one could give the example of COVID. We all learned that saying what the scientific risks are wasn't the same as communicating what the scientific risks were. What I mean, what science suggests the risks to the public were. So there's a difference between what we can find out in research and how much even researchers themselves would listen to. And it can be more complex than that. We shouldn't necessarily, I think, blame the men of this research here. It could be that some of this quality is judged by them. Could be that they have, as it were, higher standards if they're going to be accused. And I think as a scientist, that is a good scientific attitude to have. The problem arises when we don't have enough research. You need more research, more reflection, more discussion at the mainstream, at the institutions. And even more so, what can be said, the tech factor or the innovator factor and all the myths that go around that. We are in the era of all sorts of omics, precision medicine, big data, artificial intelligence, and health disparities, equity research, focus groups, interview services. That somehow, as these authors suggest, sounds a little bit banal, archaic, small, insignificant by comparison. And certainly anybody of us would know that it's much more impactful to try to publish some kind of new 7 Tesla fMRI study than try to point out to some inequality. So it's in this context that we thought that it's not just enough to do equity action. It's not enough to do research on these things. But what you want to do is organize, institutionalize, bring to the mainstream, and combine research methods and perspectives, and sort of organize that area of our research endeavors. And Center starts with a core value that research actually can be a key contributor to the scientific research content and culture, to improving it, as well as physical and mental health outcomes for all. Our vision is to foster a world-leading tradition of quality research in brain sciences and set new global standards for knowledge generation, culture, and practice. And we want to do that by supporting the people that can do it, the researchers, but also understanding solutions regarding equality challenges, systemic processes, and more broadly, the culture of science, education, and society. And this is a little bit the nitty-gritty, just to give you a sense of some of the lessons we've already learned by our humble first steps in the past 2 years. So first of all, we started with the people. So we had all these ideas. I've been forming them in my head and speaking with our vice deans and deans and other equality team members for a long time. But we went to our faculty and we asked what they thought and we listened. And we also even gave them a little bit of money to see how they would do if we give them some power to investigate. And then we launched and we tried to invite policymakers and, as I said, journalists, make sure that we're not sitting in our little tower, not speaking to the outside world. We very quickly felt we need expertise. This is complex. I fail every time I try to deal with a topic. There's also reputational costs. There's conflict costs. It's not an easy area to work. And so we needed fairly independent internal and external advisory boards to come and advise us. And we also needed to diversify and continue to be bottom-up as well as top-down. So we started forming what we call RIGs, research interest groups on inclusive assembly, or design, etc. And then we did progress to our first formal funding call. We funded 6 projects and we let the topic roughly up to them. So we wanted to be generous, not just with the money, but really with the ideas. So invest that they know better than us. And then by the winter, we have failed in a lot of things. We managed to achieve all our administrative targets, but forming an advisory board on equity, who is it going to be on the board? Is it going to be just academics? Surely that would be mad, given what we're trying to do. Okay, great. Let's invite some non-academics. So who's going to pay them? Who's going to empower them and train them and ensure the language is right? And if they are from neurodiverse backgrounds, for example, then they have special preferences and needs. And so we applied for a grant to do exactly that, to co-produce even the leadership of and the advisory board of our centre. We took a step back, as it were, and say, well, let's start co-designing from the get-go. And we also learned something about inclusive sampling, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. We thought it was one thing that you do. You try to diversify your sample, you try to increase access in research, you try to be more inclusive, and therefore you have to engage with the communities. It turns out to be a little bit more complex than that. So we now come to understand that you might have to do, I say two, but in reality there are really three very different kind of things I can think of to really be inclusive in sampling in most of our fields. And we got another grant exactly to try to do some of this. So we know, for example, at the local level, that means local communities, urban communities around UCL, that chronic underrepresentation of ethnic groups pertains to a lot of neurological and psychological challenges such as dementia. So we were awarded a grant to generate researcher guidelines on sampling practices based on insights from multiple stakeholders and local communities. So we partnered up with all these people, from funders to the local clinics, to the local rehabilitation centers, to patients, to their relatives, to their friends, to their activist communities. And we thought we were going to be, coming up with good ideas about inclusive sampling. It was certainly on the ground, and it was certainly community-based and community-led. However, very quickly we saw that all of that immediately brings attention with anything rural, because it was extremely urban. UCL is very urban, so we can be excused like this. Maybe another university in the UK can do that. But already we have the insight that it's not one fits all. And of course, it says very little about the global level. We tried to see if we could do a little extension of some of the things we were learning, and even using terms across different countries and even understanding historical complexities turned out to be far more complex than we had anticipated. So we did something else. We looked in our midst. As I said, we do have the benefit of amazing researchers. So this is an example of how you do inclusive sampling at a global level. And as you can see, it is very, very different. So the See Here Quest, maybe some of you know this, is a mobile game, also in VR version. It's a citizen science effort. And it was developed at UCL in 2016 with a collaboration with a private company as well as the Alzheimer's Research UK. It's a charity. And Hugo Spears, who is our co-lead in our inclusive sample research interest groups. And they really wanted to get to people. They weren't so optimistic as they managed to get to. They got to 4.5 million participants across their platform. And now they have over 14,000 years worth of data that have already analyzed and published. But that's going straight to the population, as we call it. And of course, it's an extremely varied sample across many countries, across people that we don't typically reach with our recruitment efforts, either in our health side of things or in our basic research. Another effort, the neuromuscular diseases. So the field knows that there are vast data inequalities which are limiting the understanding of the genetic diversity of neuromuscular diseases, which in itself prevents accurate genetic diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment tailoring. Largely, most databases are, I'm ashamed to say, European. So the MRC, the Medical Research Council, International Research for Genomic Medicine in Neuromuscular Disease, connected 18 different research efforts, including Brazil, India, South Africa, Turkey, Zambia, Netherlands, and us. That hadn't happened before. And they had to work at it. They had to see how they're going to do cloud-based services that can handle the data, can handle data protection, how they can tailor the bioinformatic pipelines, and training of international fellows that would lead all that. And they had to be equally represented from these different countries. So we have these expertise in our midst. It wasn't what we were initially thinking about, but it's something that we want to invite to the center. We've already started this collaboration. We want to see, can we use this learning? What are the areas and countries that this can be applied, and what are the areas and countries that it can't be applied? And in the interest of time, I got to rush. We're doing a lot of what you would call standard activities, standard academic activities, not just grand competition, but lots of communications, engagement, like I'm doing today. Our annual symposium, trying to speak to funders, very important, because without them, we're just paying lip service to the problem. Identify and create data sets as well. Understand what is good quality equity data. And of course, for the rest of the world, generate guidelines and toolkits. We don't want this learning to just stay with us. We want open data. We're funding research, as I said, that it's driven by our staff. So none of that is the center's top-down calls. This is, what do you want to do? This is the broad areas of research that we in the center have thought can be equity research, but it's up to you what exactly you would study. And you can see that it varies from our own PhD students to how neuroimaging can and should be used in the UK. And in terms of our reflection, we have come to understand that equality research can come under these three broad categories, and we're hoping to write a white paper with this. Equality meta-research, equality in research content, research on equality itself. Now, these are related, but they are sufficiently distinct for us to categorize them. And these are some examples, and we'll have to rush now, I think. Studying inequalities and equity action in the process, culture, and systems of science, like Who Cites Who, do leadership courses work, weird sample problems, hair and skin type biases in tech, particularly neuroimaging. Diversifying the content of science. Is autism really a male disorder? Eating disorders a female Western problem? The brain and women's health more broadly across key lifestyle periods, menopause, the menstrual cycle, teenage years, pregnancy, has had research, but this research has been found to be biased and really minuscule in comparison to how common and central to women's life these life periods are. And research on equality itself, studying how inequalities develop and affect health, the neural and psychosocial mechanisms and effects of prejudice, exclusion, bias, and dehumanization. So I was just going to bring some examples here just to say, not from us, but other people have been doing research. That's where we get it in these areas. And it is quite influential. It's quite good. It doesn't always have data. A lot of the times, including this wonderful paper by you, Directing Research Towards Health Equity, are frameworks and suggestions and tried out version of how we could do it. And we think this is incredibly valuable, but we need to also systemize it and support it and bring it in the mainstream and not let it do every individual researcher unsupported. And also, you know, the field has moved on, as this paper suggests. It's not exactly that a scientist can go out and be, you know, racist these days, thank God. But implicitly, we operate in a system that has deeply embedded inequalities. And neuroscientific methods are, and I would argue psychological and psychiatric methods, are a classic example. In this paper, The Sex Biases in Neuroscience, is all about animal work, not gender, sex in animal work. And it's mind-blowing how much male species, whatever that means in each species, is selected, prioritized in research. And in our methods, the way it works, for example, is that we've developed, our engineers have developed electrophysiological devices. In my research, pain, for example, is very different between the cultures, and you know, there are different safety ethical limits that simply do not apply to certain cultures. Then we think it's ethically to exclude people based on these pain threshold limits, rather than to include people and understand why their culture brings about different responses. Or in electrophysiological devices, you know, there are differences, how light obviously picks up different skin tones, or how you can apply certain measurements like EEG cut on different kind of hair. And we have all these, for example, strange universal emotions theories about how people should react, and we detect differences. And then we find in these bias methods that some people don't give us reliable signal, clear enough signal. And then we say, then it's okay to exclude them. It's not really discrimination, it's just convenience, it's good science, it's validity. But really, it's just a huge systemic error. And diversity in the content of science is a related topic, but we're seeing more and more and more how a lot of our diagnoses were subject to bias and simply lack of data, or hidden processes by which certain data gets generalized as though it applies to everybody. So we have a lot to learn, and we need to allow diversity in people and methods in order to learn it. And perhaps a more difficult area, but quite specific to neuroscience and the mind. I said I'll return to this. I sometimes feel we're going to make a mess of it, and yet we have responsibility to get our hands dirty. Because a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, inequality, bias, prejudice relies on people essentializing in the past and using nature or biology to justify certain divisions and categorizations that have, if not exclusively, to a large degree, much more complex social aspects to them. So really, we are the fields that ought to be taking a lot of responsibility in driving some of this understanding. And again, there's a lot of efforts and a lot of wills, but are they supported by our system? Lots of interesting insights, particularly in social neuroscience, political neuroscience, cultural neuroscience. And it's not going to be easy at all, particularly this last one. Psychiatry certainly has learned some mistakes about it's a good thing to try to use neuroscience, but not if you're really putting unequal emphasis in factors that don't seem to be driving deterioration or in mental health, for example. And if you are ignoring things like socioeconomic status, because, some EEG results suggest otherwise. But that applies also in generally trying to use any indirect measure of the brain. I think it's both important that we use macro scale events, right? And try to see if that has an effect on our health and our brains. But it's very easy to fall to a lot of epistemological, objectifying, reductionistic essentialism pitfalls. It's also very difficult not to relativize and go the other extreme. And it's very difficult. I'm not going to propose one solution, but certainly I would say this kind of research allows us to have discussions on the philosophy, the epistemology, the humanities of science, and the science of the humanities. Cool. And I wasn't able to cover it all. I really think I never do. I don't do justice, and certainly haven't emphasized as much as I could disability or religion or belief or gender reassignment, or indeed homelessness, poverty, community violence, abuse. There's a lot in this area, and I'm aware we can't do it all, but at least I'm trying to stay mindful. And sometimes I'm not doing a very good job. Sometimes I just want to just close my eyes, to be honest, and feel that what we do is a drop in the ocean is just never going to be enough, isn't it? It's just a big challenge. And maybe I am too small, trying to sort of recreate the parental couple for any of you that's trained in that way is a very known omnipotent position. Maybe I'm just too small to be doing any of this. Maybe it doesn't fall on our shoulders to try to do this integration. But then I always remind myself that actually the difference, physical difference, the distance between Asia and Europe, for those that care to go close and look, is tiny. In the Bosphorus, the little strand of sea that separates the two continents that my parents come from is 3 kilometers. And maybe if I work with others across the continents, maybe we can have a huge ripple effect together. And of course, funders help a lot. So I'm very grateful to UCLA for allowing this passion to become reality. Other funders are partners that really offering the knowledge and expertise. And of course, you for your attention today. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful and timely and thoughtful and action-oriented grand round. It was really special. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it's just really inspiring to learn about all of your work and the work that's happening at UCL and your Center for Equality Research in Brain Sciences. So thank you. I hope that you can. It's hard. It's virtual, but I hope that you can sense through the screen our applause and gratitude that we're sending you from Los Angeles.
Thank you.
So I just want to remind everyone, please enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. But while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I wanted to start with a question, and one is that it's broad. It's is that unfortunately inequalities and marginalization is ubiquitous in science, and that's the point that you made. And you did speak, quite a bit on brain and mind sciences. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on how they're unique, and maybe some unique opportunities as well.
I did allude to it a little bit, and there's a lot to say, but the obvious thing is because our sciences touch on health, right? So that's one very big thing. So everything we say, even if it's not meant to be applied or policy oriented, think of what we've done to vaccines, various vaccine resistances, and there's been scandals with doctors, perpetrating all sorts of myths. So we do have responsibility, not just to do research, to do action, but to showcase it, model it in our fields, because as we saw with COVID, what we do as scientists entails a society trusting us at times of risk and uncertainty. And that is a very special position in terms of health that other people don't have it. They have it in other things, say climate change. The other thing is, as I alluded to, this sort of the bad, it's their history. Really, our history is very guilty, right? So since physiognomy, we have the tendency to judge people based on their appearance, and we don't stop there. We don't judge them for their appearance. We judge them for their character, their traits based on the appearance. That was physiognomy. And then that was essentialism. And if anybody's interested, the history of the science of beauty is fascinating. We think beauty is for fashionistas, but actually mind scientist, what was at the time sort of neurological psychiatric altogether, has the tendency to objectify character in beauty. To sort of be able to describe purity and morality and good character. So, on the basis of that, we then built deeply ingrained genetic theories about race that are just not true and they're absolutely criminal. So, and I hate to say it, but some of the worst racists in history have actually used science to try to get to what they thought were essential categories. And they didn't use just science. They tend to use areas in mental brain health that are complex and have gaps, such as the mind-brain connection, one of our bigger challenges, right? Such as the complicated causation system, like the biopsychosocial model, that we need to understand our ailments in the mind and brain and in our body. So wherever there is complexity and gaps is space for inequality, is space for ideology to fill in. And science has this tremendous potential for understanding, which comes with a tremendous risk for misunderstanding. So I think our science are special in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it really reminded me, there was one slide I think that you showed where there was the difficult patient or the non-responder, and how bias can be encoded, right, even in contemporary science. So thank you for that answer.
Yeah. I mean, functional neurological disease, you can, everything about this disorder, the so-called hysterics, psychogenic, we've thrown everything at it. Sexuality interpretation, gender interpretation, too crazy psychosomatic interpretation, too extreme neurological interpretation, everything on it. It's just one disorder, and you can see the history of our bias.
Absolutely. And again, in your answer, it's the focus on action, and that's what I really appreciated from your presentation. For the sake of time, I want to ask one last question. So there's a question in the chat from Dr. Jim Spar, and he writes, "What about the extent to which EDI has become a hotly politicized issue, at least in the U.S. and I might add probably in the UK as well?" I wonder if you could speak to that.
Increasingly so, yeah. And that is very difficult because, of course, we know from social sciences that anything that's already politicized, you will be as receptive as your own political beliefs, and most specifically what we know from psychological science, your own radical thinking about your beliefs, right? So there's going to be a spectrum of people that we will always miss because an issue has been, we won't be able to reach at all, not in a meaningful way, because the issue has been politicized and radicalized. So it is unfortunate in that regard. But then again, everything I said today stems from the belief that I think science is political anyway. I don't believe in I'm not, disclaimer, I'm not a post-structuralist and I'm not a relativist, but I don't think that science is nevertheless independent from political and moral and other positions. However, the science does have an advantage, whatever, the spectrum of people we have to lose at each case. Has the advantage that it's a democratic way of trying to get to some kind of agreed truth. Because even though we may disagree on the truth we're getting and our political beliefs may get in the way, what isn't subject to our political beliefs is the common criteria that we have in order to decide what's more or less good or bad science, what's more or less temporary truth, what's more or less shareable truth, right? This more or less matters because politics find its way there, but it's better than anything else we have. That and dialogue with a big D, it's better.
Such a wonderful answer. Yeah, thank you so much. And, I know we're getting close to the hour, and I just want to use the rest of this time to say thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your expertise and your insights with us. It really was special to make this connection between UCLA and UCL. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. For a pleasure to be here. Thank you again. Bye-bye.